If you only look at a map, the Taiwan question seems simple. China is bigger. China is richer. China fields a much larger military. So the lazy conclusion is, if Xi Jinping really decides to take Taiwan, he can. The only question is when. I think that conclusion's too shallow. It treats this like a flat military comparison instead of what it actually is. A live decision system shaped by leadership, psychology, societal resilience, misperception, and the way real options open and close over time. In this episode of Global Power Shifts, I want to walk through that deeper picture. I'm going to use 4 of my own frameworks. CPP, Convergentia Polaris Potentia. SFI, the Societal Functionality Index. Vector game, and the battlesphere. Together, they let us ask better questions than, can China beat Taiwan? The better question is this: can Xi Jinping actually move the entire system into a successful conquest of Taiwan without breaking the political, military, economic, and societal structure? He personally depends on what? My answer is simply this: China can pressure Taiwan, China can isolate Taiwan, China can punish Taiwan, China may even be able to blockade Taiwan, at least for periods of time. But a successful invasion and durable control are far less straightforward than the map suggests. The reason is not just American intervention. The reason is that the system Xi would have to move is much more fragile and distortion prone than most people realize. While Taiwan is smaller, but more functionally resilient in several ways that matter in war. Let's unpack that. Most analysis starts off with industrial capacity, ship counts, missile inventories, and GDP. Now, those things do matter, but by themselves, they create the illusion that war is a spreadsheet problem. In reality, war is a multi-actor decision environment. Perception, timing, institutional rigidity, domestic resilience, and unintended consequences. These are actually what shapes what is possible. That's where the battlesphere comes in. The battlesphere treats a conflict as a decision space, an end sphere of possible directions, inside which options expand and collapse over time. Now, I talk about this in terms of funnels and tan waves. In plain language, that means a Taiwan crisis is not a straight line from tension to invasion. It is a sequence of windows where options open, narrow, deform, and sometimes vanish altogether. Inside that battlesphere, vector game helps us track the major pushes acting on the crisis. Every action or pressure point becomes a vector with direction, strength, and phase. These vectors can reinforce each other, cancel each other, or create sideways distortions and unintended consequences, what I call bleed. So, before we even compare militaries, we need to understand three things. First and foremost, the leaders. Then we need to understand the societies and the vector field they're operating inside. Let's start with CPP. CPP is my framework for understanding where leaders derive their sense of power, control, and meaning. CPP looks at two main things. First, where their power comes from on the intrinsicus extrinsicus axis. Intrinsicus is power that mostly self-derived from personal conviction, expertise, or internal authority. Extrinsicus is power that mostly derived from belonging to and controlling institutions, the party, the state, the military, the bureaucracy. Second, CPP looks at egoism and altruism. How much decisions are orientated towards self and system versus towards others. Xi Jinping sits far towards the extrinsicus end of the continuum, with high egoism, low altruism. In practical terms, his power lives in the party, the state, the security services, the PLA, the institutional machinery that keeps him at the center. His decisions are orientated towards preserving and magnifying the system. That matters. It matters because CPP suggests that extreme extrinsicus actors often move quickly and rigidly, not because they are simply irrational, but because they are heavily dependent on narrow channels of validation and control. G can appear patient, but that patience is not the same thing as flexibility. It is often a controlled institutional patience designed to preserve leverage until conditions favor movement. In CPP terms, G's willingness to impose sacrifice is real. He can demand sacrifice from others for the system. But he is much less free to accept a failure that visibly weakens the party, weakens the PLA, or weakens his personal legitimacy, because that would strike directly at the extrinsicus base of his power. So, G is dangerous, but he is not unconstrained. He is powerful, but he is also politically trapped by the kind of power he depends on. Now let's compare that to Taiwan's president, Lei Ching-te. Lei sits much closer to the middle band between intrinsicus and extrinsicus. Some of his power comes from institutions, the presidency, the state, but a lot of his authority depends on persuasion, coalition building, and public legitimacy inside a democratic system. CPP suggests that leaders in this zone tend to decide more slowly because they integrate internal judgment with external input. But that slower pattern can produce better long-run choices in high-stakes situations when time exists to think. This does not make Lei stronger in coercive terms. It makes him differently strong. He cannot simply command total obedience through a rigid hierarchy. But he also has less incentive to launch reckless gambles because this legitimacy depends on preserving a functioning community, not merely preserving a system of personal control. For Taiwan, that logic is defensive and absorptive. Lei does not need to conquer anyone. He needs to preserve Taiwan's viability, hold domestic cohesion, attract outside support, and make the cost of coercion intolerably high for Beijing. So if we put this in a clean comparison, Xi's power is heavily extrinsicus, rooted in institutions that cannot easily survive visible failure. Lei's power is between intrinsicus and extrinsicus, rooted in both institution and social legitimacy, with more incentive to avoid catastrophic gambles. That means their vector fields are fundamentally different. Xi has to move the system towards domination. Lei mainly has to prevent collapse and stretch time. This is where SFI, the Societal Functionality Index, becomes critical. SFI is not a wealth score or a prestige score. It is a functionality-first framework. It uses things like infrastructure reliability, economic sufficiency, safety, health, and social trust and cohesion. It uses these factors to estimate how a society tends to function in practice. This is explicitly reductive and descriptive. It's meant to be read in tends to be language, not as an absolute verdict. Applied broadly, China is not a simple story. It contains highly capable, technologically advanced, well-integrated zones. It also contains uneven infrastructure, severe local disparities, heavy institutional dependence, and trust distortions that matter more in a protracted war than they do in a peacetime investor presentation. SFI matters because large states can look strong from the top down while being brittle in their lived functionality across regions and populations. Even if elite coastal zones are robust, the total system still has to absorb sanctions, trade disruptions, energy stress, mobilization friction, information control burdens, casualty management, and the uncertainty of a long-duration campaign. A war over Taiwan would not test China's parade ground image. It would test whether Chinese society can maintain sufficient real-world functionality under sustained stress. That is a very different question. Taiwan is smaller, but SFI directs us to ask a different question. Does it tend to function more reliably in the areas that matter for war endurance? On infrastructure, health, safety, institutional transparency, and broad social coordination, Taiwan tends to start from a stronger functional baseline than many authoritarian systems do, especially under stress. That does not make Taiwan invulnerable. It is exposed to blockade, missile strikes, cyber disruptions, and the geographic reality of being an island under direct military pressure from a much larger neighbor. But SFI suggests that smaller size does not automatically equal lower resilience. In some cases, smaller systems coordinate faster, signals of trust and risk are clearer, and adaptation can be quicker. One of the central areas in the conventional narrative is this. People can compare China and Taiwan as if raw size automatically determines which society can sustain the more coherent response under pressure. SFI pushes back on that. A bigger system can absorb more in some ways, but it can also suffer from more internal drag, more hidden brittleness, and more dependence on top-down control. Now put Xi, Lei, China, and Taiwan inside the battlesphere. The core idea of the battlesphere is that what matters is not just who has more options on paper, but how the decision funnel expands and collapses over time. Early in a crisis, options may widen as actors test responses, gather intelligence, signal partners, move forces, and probe for weaknesses. Then something changes. A deadline hits. A red line is crossed. A partner hesitates. A domestic shock erupts. One option becomes dominant, and suddenly the funnel rotates and narrows. That's the battlesphere's insight. War is not a single decision. It is a sequence of changing decision spaces, each with its own geometry and risk. For Taiwan, this is crucial. Xi does not just need the military capacity to invade. He needs the right funnel collapse. He needs a wave in which Taiwan's options have narrowed, US and Japanese ambiguity has increased, domestic Chinese pressure is manageable, sanctions risk is tolerable, the PLA is politically trusted, and the legitimacy gains for him appear larger than the systematic risk. That is much more restrictive condition than China is stronger. In battlesphere language, Xi needs a favorable alignment of vectors and a manageable level of deformation or bleed. Because unintended consequences can reshape the decision space faster than original plans assume. This is where vector game does the real work. Vector game integrates CPP with hypergame theory. It combines leadership motivation with misperception and deception inside the battlesphere. So we are not just asking what Xi and Lei want. We are asking what each side believes the other wants, what each side misreads, and how those distortions change the direction and strength of strategic action. Think about some of the major vectors in the Taiwan system right now. PLA modernization and coercive signaling. Taiwan's internal resilience and asymmetric defense posture. US intervention, uncertainty, and alliance credibility. Japanese regional security interests. Economic decoupling and sanctions risk. Chinese domestic legitimacy pressures and elite control. Information operations, narrative warfare, and miscalculation. Vector game says these are not static variables. They are moving vectors that sometimes reinforce each other and sometimes they collide. If Xi believes the United States lacks resolve, that misperception can strengthen his escalation vector. If Taiwan believes China is bluffing, when Beijing is actually preparing a higher risk move, that misperception weakens Taiwan's timing. When multiple misreads stack at once, the system becomes far more dangerous than a simple material comparison suggests. That is the value of vector game. It highlights how a war can become more likely, not because one actor suddenly becomes overwhelmingly stronger, but because the vector field becomes distorted by egoism, misread incentives, and converging pressures. Viewed through vector game and the battlesphere, a full amphibious invasion is only one vector, and often not Xi's preferred one, unless the funnel narrows dramatically in his favor. There are other vectors that may offer him gains with lower systematic risk, such as military drills and shows of force, blockade pressure, and customs inspections, gray zone operations around islands and airspace, cyber attacks on infrastructure and institutions, political warfare and influence operations, economic coercion and targeted sanctions, or controlled crisis escalation that stops short of full war. Why? Because those vectors allow Xi to preserve ambiguity and test reactions. They do this while keeping more off-ramps open inside the bathysphere. A full invasion collapses the funnel hard and fast. Once launched, it produces enormous bleed risk, military failure, sanctions blowback, elite panic, energy shocks, domestic unrest, and the possibility that what was supposed to be a demonstration of strength becomes the beginning of a systematic weakening. That does not mean invasion is impossible. It means that from Xi's CPP position and within his current vector field, coercive pressure may offer and appear more rational than outright conquest. Unless he comes to believe that delay itself is more dangerous to his legitimacy than escalation, that is the hinge. This is where vector game logic matters. Wars often happen not when one side correctly calculates everything, but when actors operate inside different perceived games. Xi may think the United States is too divided or distracted to sustain a defense commitment. Washington may think Xi is too rational to risk systemic damage. Taiwan may think stronger international sympathy automatically converts into timely military effect. Those are not trivial errors. They are conflict shaping distortions. When misperceptions line up with egoistic power structures, the whole field can move towards high-risk outcomes. Even though, from a wider systems view, war is a terrible bargain for nearly everyone involved. This is another reason why raw military comparison misleads. It assumes a shared game board with shared payoffs. Vector game assumes the opposite. Actors often inhabit overlapping but not identical games, and their vectors are shaped by those perceived realities. So what does the Taiwan funnel actually look like? In an expansion phase, China increases pressure, but stops short of an invasion. Taiwan strengthens its deterrence posture. The US and partners raise costs. The crisis becomes more complex, but not yet terminal. In that phase, there are still many viable directions. coercive bargaining, mutual signaling, temporary de-escalation, military rehearsal, sanction signaling, alliance adjustment, and leadership repositioning. In a collapse phase, one or more triggers fires. A political deadline in Beijing, a declaration or symbolic move in Taipei, a military accident in the Strait, a domestic legitimacy crisis in China, a sharp perceived drop in American credibility, or the emergence of one dominant signal that rotates a system towards escalation. The dangerous moment is not simply when China gets strong enough. The dangerous moment is when the funnel narrows enough that Xi perceives coercive half measures as insufficient and invasion as the least bad remaining option. That is a battlesphere problem, not just an order of battle problem. So how does this actually play out over time? Let me sketch 3 scenarios and how likely I think each one is. Scenario 1. This is the long coercion, no invasion. And I put this at roughly 55 to 60%. In this path, China leans on drills, air and naval incursions, economic pressure, and cyber operations. Taiwan hardens defenses and deepens its asymmetric posture. The United States and Japan tighten coordination. But everyone works hard to stop short of decisive triggers. The crisis becomes a long, grinding coercion campaign, not a sudden war. Scenario 2, blockade crisis and near war. I put this at roughly between 25 to 30% likelihood. In this scenario, China experiments with quasi-blockade tools, often called inspections, harassment of shipping, selective interdictions that look like law enforcement on paper, but operate like pressure on Taiwan's lifelines. We see repeated standoffs at sea and in the air, heavy sanction threats, and market volatility. Each episode stops short of invasion, but brinksmanship becomes the new norm. Scenario 3. This scenario is the attempted invasion after funnel collapse. And I put this roughly around 10 to 15%. In this path, internal or external shocks convince Xi the time is no longer on his side. That could be demographic pressure, economic slowdown, elite instability, or a political move in Taipei that Beijing frames as a breaking point. The battlesphere narrows. Xi reads coercion as insufficient. A short, decisive campaign looks to Xi like the least bad remaining option. This is the highest bleed scenario for everyone involved. Now, this is not a 30-day or 60-day story. Most of these dynamics move very, very slowly. But over the next 90 days, if you're trying to tell which funnel we're drifting towards, here are a few things to watch. First, the scale and character of PLA drills around Taiwan? Do they still look like signaling, or do they start to look like rehearsals for blockade patterns in isolation? Second, shifts in US and Japanese force posture and language. Do their actions and statements become more explicit about defending Taiwan or more hedged and ambiguous? Third, signs of stress inside China. Usually purges, tightened information control, or public campaigns that frame Taiwan as a near-term historic task can all change the vector field. Fourth, Taiwan's own choices, concrete moves on asymmetric defenses, mobilization and resilience, or signs of domestic fragmentation. That will shape how Xi reads the cost of coercion versus invasion. Fifth, economic and sanction positioning. Any clear preparation for sanctions on either side or new mechanisms to blunt them will change the perceived cost of escalation. These indicators won't tell us everything, but they will hint at whether we are staying in a long coercion funnel, sliding toward a blockade crisis, or setting up the conditions under which an invasion starts to look to Xi like a live option. So, with all that, here's the direct answer. Xi may be able to launch a war. He may be able to inflict terrible damage. He may be able to create a blockade crisis. He may even convince himself that a short, sharp operation is viable. But actually taking Taiwan and converting that into a durable political control is a much harder proposition than most simplistic analysis admit. CPP suggests Xi's power structure gives him both the motive and the rigidity to contemplate high-risk action. But it also leaves him unusually vulnerable to failure because his legitimacy is fused with institutional dominance. SFI suggests China's broader societal functionality under stress is more uneven and potentially more brittle than surface metrics imply. While Taiwan's smaller but more coherent functional base may endure pressure better than outsiders assume. Vector game suggests the pattern to war depends heavily on interacting vectors and misperceptions, not just force ratios. And the battle sphere suggests that what matters most is the timing and geometry of decision collapse. When options narrow, bleed rises, and actors stop believing there are safe alternatives left. So, if you ask me, can Xi take Taiwan? Here's what I would say. He can try. He can threaten. He can coerce. And he can make the system far more dangerous. But whether he can successfully seize and hold Taiwan without triggering crippling bleed across the wider battlesphere, that is far, far more doubtful. And that is a point people keep missing. The Taiwan question is not a simple contest of mass. It is a live contest of power cores, societal resilience, misperception, strategic timing, and narrowing decision funnels. If we keep looking at Taiwan as a flat map problem, we will keep missing the real danger. The danger is not just that China is strong. The danger is that strong and fragile can coexist inside the same system, and that a leader whose power depends on institutional dominance may eventually face a funnel in which coercion no longer feels sufficient. That is why I don't dismiss the threat, but I also don't accept the lazy assumption that size alone settles the question. In a conflict like this, what matters is who can hold coherence longer, who misreads less, who keeps more options open, and who survives the bleed when the battlesphere funnels start collapsing. If you found this useful, please subscribe to Global Power Shifts. Share this episode with someone who still thinks the Taiwan question is just a numbers problem. And let me know which power contest you'd like me to break down next.